We like to think of history as a straight line. In our heads, it's a neat, tidy ladder of progress where we get a little bit smarter, a little bit safer, and a little bit more civilized with every passing year. But if you actually open the archives and look at the raw data, you find that history isn't a straight line at all. It's a messy, chaotic scramble. It is a collection of terrifying accidents, bizarre misunderstandings, and moments where the natural world did things that defied the logic of the people living through them. When we really look back, we find that reality is frequently stranger, and often more violent and ironic, than any fiction writer would dare to invent. From the comical absurdity of putting insects on trial to the terrifying majesty of nuclear reactors that built themselves billions of years ago, and our timeline is paved with events that sound like lies, but they aren't. They are verified by hard science and dusty court records. So let's take a walk through the uncomfortable gap between what happened and what we understood. Let's look at how humanity has struggled to comprehend a world that is far more powerful and far more complex than we ever give it credit for. Part 1. The era of misguided medicine and legal absurdity selling. Nothing to a choking world. Let's start in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The Industrial Revolution was in full swing, reshaping the globe with steel and steam. But there was a cost. It was also poisoning the planet. The great urban centers of the world, London, New York, Paris, were choked with thick, yellow coal smoke. Respiratory diseases like tuberculosis weren't just common. They were the leading killers of the age. In this climate of medical desperation, where people were literally coughing their lungs out, a peculiar industry emerged. They started selling bottled air. Now, this wasn't some avant-garde art project or a metaphorical statement. This was a serious, money-making medical enterprise. Entrepreneurs noticed something simple. When sick people went to the mountains or the countryside to recover in sanatoriums, they got better. Today, we know that's because their immune systems had a chance to fight back without the constant assault of pollution. But back then, they confused correlation with causation. They thought the air itself was a drug. They believed the atmosphere of the Alps or the countryside contained a tangible, medicinal substance. So, companies began harvesting air from pristine locations, compressing it into canisters, and shipping it to suffocating city dwellers. The marketing was incredibly sophisticated. They promised that a few puffs of this bottled wind would cure fatigue, calm your shattered nerves, and even extend your life. To make it feel legitimate, they didn't just sell you a can. They sold you complex inhalation devices with tubes and gauges that mimicked the serious medical equipment of the day. And the wildest part? Doctors supported it. Medical journals wrote about it. It reveals a fascinating phase in the history of science, the period of observation without mechanism. They knew that fresh air helped, but they didn't know how. Lacking knowledge of bacteriology or immunology, they ended up commercializing the medium rather than the mechanism. They were selling hope in a bottle, simply because they didn't yet have the language to explain why the city was killing them. The courtroom of the absurd. If bottled air was a misunderstanding of medicine, what happened in the courtrooms of the Middle Ages was a profound misunderstanding of consciousness itself. From the medieval period right through to early modern Europe, it wasn't uncommon for animals to be formally charged with crimes. And we aren't talking about a farmer yelling at his dog. We are talking about solemn legal trials. Picture the scene: a courtroom in France, 1386. The defendant is standing in the dock. The defendant is a pig. The charge? The murder of a child. This wasn't a joke. The pig had a defense lawyer. There was a prosecutor. Witnesses were called to the stand to give testimony. The pig was imprisoned in the local jail, tried, and eventually found guilty. But it gets stranger. To carry out the sentence, the court ordered the pig to be dressed in a human waistcoat and breeches before being publicly executed in the town square. This absurdity extended to the smallest creatures. Ecclesiastical courts, church courts, would issue summons to swarms of locusts or rats that were eating the crops. There is a famous case where a lawyer representing a group of rats successfully argued that his clients couldn't attend their court date. His reasoning? They would have to travel through a town filled with cats, and therefore they were in danger of life and limb. The judge accepted this as a valid legal excuse and delayed the trial. It's funny to us now. It sounds like a Monty Python sketch. But these trials reveal a deep psychological need for order. The medieval worldview saw divine law as universal. It applied to everything. If a pig killed a child, it wasn't just a tragic accident of nature, it was a moral violation. It broke the rules of the universe. By putting the animal on trial, humans were trying to impose bureaucracy upon chaos. It was their way of saying, we are in control, and the law applies to everyone, even if the defendant had a tail and 4 legs. Part 2. Giants in the Earth. Nature's overwhelming power. The day the sky fell. While we were busy putting pigs in waistcoats, the universe was preparing to remind us of our actual place in the pecking order. In 1908, over a remote region of the Siberian taiga near the Podkamenaya Tunguska River, the sky seemed to split open. A massive explosion, estimated to be about 1,000 times more powerful than the atomic bomb later dropped on Hiroshima, detonated over the forest. The blast flattened approximately 80 million trees over an area of more than 2,000 square kilometers. Eyewitnesses described a fireball that outshone the sun and a heat wave that could be felt miles away. The shockwave was so powerful it circumnavigated the globe. It shattered windows hundreds of kilometers away and rattled seismic stations as far away as England. But here is the mystery. There was no crater. For decades, the Tunguska event baffled scientists. It wasn't until later geological expeditions that we understood it was an airburst. A meteor or a fragment of a comet had slammed into our atmosphere and, due to the immense pressure and heat, detonated in the sky before it ever touched the ground. Now, this event is a chilling reminder. Nuclear-scale destruction is not a human invention. The cosmos throws rocks at us with energy outputs that make our most potent weapons look like firecrackers. It was sheer dumb luck that this happened over an uninhabited forest. If that rock had arrived a few hours later, due to the rotation of the Earth, it could have detonated over St. Petersburg, London, or Moscow. We would be telling a very different history today. The reactor under our feet. If Tunguska showed us the violence of space, a discovery in 1972 showed us the brilliance of the Earth itself. French physicists were analyzing uranium ore samples from a mine in Oklo, Gabon. They noticed something weird. The samples were missing a tiny, specific percentage of uranium-235. That's the specific isotope you need to fuel a nuclear reaction. They traced the anomaly back to the mine and discovered something that shouldn't have been possible. They found the remains of a nuclear reactor, but this wasn't built by humans, it was built by geology. 2 billion years ago, the laws of physics and the layout of the rocks conspired to create a natural fission reactor. Back then, the natural concentration of uranium-235 was higher, about 3%, which is roughly what we use in modern reactor fuel. Groundwater seeped into the uranium-rich rock and acted as a neutron moderator, which is exactly what water does in our power plants today. It slowed the neutrons down enough to trigger a chain reaction. The site became a self-regulating nuclear engine. As the reaction heated up, the water would boil away, stopping the process. As the rock cooled, the water would seep back in, restarting the reaction. This cycle continued on and off for hundreds of thousands of years. The Oklo reactor shattered the ego of modern science. We thought we invented the atomic age in the 1940s. We didn't. We merely discovered a process that nature had perfected, operated, and safely contained within rock billions of years before the first human ever stood upright. The Halifax explosion, a preview of Armageddon. Sometimes, humanity encounters these forces before we have the words to describe them. In 1917, decades before the Manhattan Project, the city of Halifax in Canada experienced the horror of a nuclear detonation without the radiation. The SS Mont Blanc, a French cargo ship packed to the brim with high explosives for the war in Europe, collided with another vessel in the harbor and caught fire. The resulting blast was the largest man-made explosion prior to the atomic age. It didn't just damage the city, it erased parts of it. It leveled neighborhoods, vaporized the ship, and created a tsunami that washed over the ruins. Nearly 2,000 people died instantly. But the medical aftermath is what's truly haunting. Doctors at the time were treating injuries they had never seen before. They saw flash burns without a fire source. They saw internal organs ruptured by shockwaves alone. They treated blindness caused by millions of fragments of shattered glass. They were effectively treating nuclear injuries in a pre-nuclear world. They had no framework to understand the scale of the trauma. This event demonstrated that the physical forces of destruction scale up in ways that human language and science are often unprepared to handle. We experienced the apocalypse before we had the science to name it. Part 3. The Invisible Hand, Unintended Consequences. The Ozone Paradox. Our impact on the world isn't always about explosions. Sometimes it's about the quiet, invisible mistakes we make while trying to do something good. Take the story of chlorofluorocarbons, or CFCs. Invented in the early 20th century, CFCs were hailed as a miracle of chemistry. They were non-toxic, non-flammable, and incredibly stable. They were perfect for refrigeration and spray cans. Their inventor, Thomas Migley Jr., was so confident in them that he famously inhaled the gas publicly to prove it was safe. And for humans, it was safe. But for the planet, it was a slow-acting poison. The very stability that made CFCs safe for us made them deadly for the atmosphere. Because they didn't break down here, they drifted up to the stratosphere. There, struck by high-energy ultraviolet radiation, they finally broke apart, releasing chlorine atoms. And it turns out, a single chlorine atom is a serial killer for ozone molecules. One atom can destroy thousands of them. This created the ozone hole, a thinning of the Earth's protective shield against radiation. When scientists discovered this in the 1970s, people were skeptical. The idea that invisible gas from your hairspray could alter the physics of the planet seemed ludicrous. It was one of the first concrete proofs that human activity could damage the Earth's life support systems on a planetary scale, not through malice, but through the unintended side effects of safe technology. The pollution that lives forever. For most of history, our solution to pollution was dilution. We thought if we dumped waste into the ocean or the air, nature would just break it down. But then we created POPs, persistent organic pollutants. These are synthetic chemicals designed for industry and agriculture that are built to last. And they do. They are resistant to environmental degradation. Once released, they don't go away. Instead, they enter what scientists call the grasshopper effect. They evaporate in warm climates, travel on the wind, and condense in cold ones. This is why we find these chemicals accumulating in the pristine ice of the Arctic, thousands of miles from the factories that made them. Even more terrifying is their ability to bioaccumulate. They move up the food chain, getting more concentrated at every step. Today, a polar bear in the Arctic may carry high loads of industrial toxins in its fat, despite never seeing a smokestack. This shifted the entire paradigm of environmental science. We realized that pollution isn't just an event, it's a self-sustaining process. We have created chemical ghosts that will haunt the ecosystem long after the factories are closed. Part 4. The Fragility of the Species. The bottleneck. We tend to view human history as a story of inevitable conquest. We look around at our cities and technology and think we were always destined to rule the planet. But genetic evidence suggests we are actually the lucky survivors of a near apocalypse. By analyzing the DNA of modern humans, scientists have found that we have surprisingly low genetic diversity compared to other species. This suggests that at some point in the past, the human population crashed. The likely culprit was the Toba supervolcano eruption in Indonesia. Roughly 74,000 years ago, it spewed enough ash to trigger a volcanic winter, cooling the planet and decimating food sources. Genetic models suggest the total human population may have dropped to as few as a couple of thousand individuals. Just think about that. For a period, humanity was an endangered species, clinging to survival in small pockets of Africa. There were no great civilizations, no written records, just a few thousand hunter-gatherers trying not to freeze or starve. We aren't here because of destiny. We are here because a small group of ancestors managed to survive a climate catastrophe that wiped out everyone else. We are a statistical improbability. The mystery of vanishing diseases. And just as humanity can nearly vanish, so can our monsters. Historical records show that certain diseases have appeared, ravaged populations, and then disappeared without explanation. Trench fever debilitated armies during World War I and then largely faded away. Forms of the plague that decimated medieval Europe subsided long before we invented antibiotics. We like to take credit for this. We talk about hygiene and immunity, but those factors don't fully explain the sudden drop-offs in mortality recorded in hospital archives. This phenomenon highlights the gaps in our medical knowledge. We often attribute the end of epidemics to human intervention, but sometimes the biological dynamics of a pathogen simply shift. We survived some diseases not because we defeated them, but because they left. It is a humbling reminder that in the war between humans and microbes, there are still truces we do not understand. Part 5. The Epistemological Gap: Why Reality Feels Unreal. So what is the thread connecting all these stories? From the pig in the waistcoat to the natural nuclear reactor, the common theme is the lag between the event and the explanation. We have this bias where we assume knowledge is synchronous with experience. We think that if something happens to us, we understand it. But history proves that we often live through events for decades or even millennia before we possess the framework to understand them. The doctors in Halifax saw the blast injuries, but they had no word for shockwave trauma. The physicists in 1940 thought they invented fission, unaware that rocks in Gabon had done it eons ago. This is why documented reality often sounds like a conspiracy theory. And the facts are often stranger than our intuition because our intuition is built on what is normal, whereas the universe operates on what is possible. Conclusion. If there is one lesson to take away from this chronicle of errors and accidents, it is intellectual humility. We are inhabitants of a planet that can generate nuclear fire on its own. We live in a biosphere where chemicals travel to the poles like ghosts. We exist on a timeline where we nearly went extinct without leaving a trace. The progress of human knowledge isn't about conquering nature. It's about slowly, painfully learning the language to describe what nature has been doing all along. As we look to the future, we have to remain open to the idea that the impossible is simply a fact that is waiting for its explanation.